From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Monday, February 9th, 2015. We'll spend the first half of our show talking to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and activist Chris Hedges about American imperialism. And Macarthur genius Ai-Jen Poo joins us in studio to discuss her new book, The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom in a Changing America. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, Jordan has launched a third day of airstrikes against Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria today. The strikes, carried out in conjunction with the United Arab Emirates and the U.S., are apparently in response to the shocking videotaped killing of a Jordanian pilot by ISIS. Britain has also stepped up its part in the fight, announcing today that it would send 2,000 special troops and a spy aircraft to aid Jordan. ISIS militants have claimed that their last remaining U.S. captive, Kayla Mueller, was killed by Jordanian airstrikes. Mueller's parents say they are hopeful that their daughter is still alive. She was captured in 2013 after she traveled to the area as an aid worker for Syrian refugees. Here in the United States, right-wing pundits and commentators are up in arms over President Obama's recent comments comparing the actions of ISIS to Christians during the Crusades. Well, Rahul, what impact can these stepped-up actions by Jordan actually have on ISIS?
Well, my first reaction is that if you think purely militarily, Jordan's actions are actually not incredibly significant. I mean, we've seen certainly a much greater volume and duration of airstrikes from the United States already, so this is just adding a small drop in that bucket in that sense, and seems to be, heavily focused around retaliation for the killing of this one hostage. But I think if you think about it in terms of the sort of ideological struggle that is being waged at the same time, it's significantly more important. I think that, it's important to note that there was, a certain amount of soft sympathy for certain jihadi groups, including some for Al-Qaeda, that was strongly affected by the attacks in Saudi Arabia in 2004, 2005, particularly. That turned a lot of people against them. In Jordan, a lot of people were turned against Zarqawi and the sort of precursor of the current Islamic State because of attacks in Jordan. So once again, we see, I think that it certainly can't hurt regionally the sort of struggle against ISIS to see a new player come in on the other side.
Here in the United States, contradicting the overwhelming legal trend to sanction gay marriage, Alabama's Chief Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore issued a letter late yesterday ordering officials to deny marriage licenses to LGBT couples. Today was expected to be the first day in Alabama that couples could legally marry regardless of sexual orientation. A state constitutional amendment banning gay marriage had been struck down by a federal judge in January, and that ruling was placed on hold until today, allowing the U.S. Supreme Court time to intervene, which it did not. Although the final decision over gay marriage in Alabama lies in the hands of 68 probate judges in the state, Justice Moore's strongly worded letter could carry weight with some, but 3 judges, in an act of protest, have announced they will not issue any marriage licenses at all to LGBT or heterosexual couples. Rahul, can a single Chief Justice at a state level really stop the movement to legalize marriage?
Well, I think that already Moore is, at least his most recent attempt, is being overcome, and as far as I can tell, they're actually proceeding with same-sex marriages in Alabama right now. So I think the answer is in the short term, no, and in the long term, again, no. I think all he can do is put up some sort of rearguard action at best.
Finally, the annual Grammy Music Awards took place last night with more than 3 hours of performances, awards, and even some political activism. After a videotaped message from President Obama about ending rape and sexual violence, 27-year-old Brooke Axtell, the survivor of horrific sexual abuse, spoke briefly about her experience and the importance of speaking out. A number of African-American artists used their platform to say that Black Lives Matter, including Beyonce, Pharrell Williams, and Prince. And members of a newly formed group called Creators Alliance took aim at online music streaming services to call for fair pay for musicians. Now, Rahul, it seemed as though the Grammys were more unabashedly political than the Oscars. What did you make of the various political statements?
Well, first I would say that the one that sort of had the most official sort of backing in the Grammys, the one about rape and sexual violence, I don't see that as a sign of politicization of the Grammys in particular. I think it's much more in the nature of a PSA. In general, child rape and sex trafficking have been considered non-controversial bipartisan issues. There's been a lot of disagreement on details of how to deal with them, but in general, I mean, even part of Bush's famous 2002 national security strategy mentioned cracking down on sex trafficking as one of the key elements of American national security. I mean, it's just it's a testament to the craziness of some people on the far right, intellectuals and politicians, that people are even thinking of this as a controversial issue. The Black Lives Matter in particular, that one is important. I think it says much more about Black Lives Matter and the emerging anti-police brutality movement than it does about the Grammys specifically. I think it's going to become a sort of cultural fixture. We're going to see a lot more of it, and it's going to continue because unlike with wars, apparently, this one can keep on going, because every time now that a black person is killed by the police, it's a new event that will give strength to the movement.
Rahul, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. Although the United States spends more money on its military than any other nation in the world, President Obama has deemed its budget to be insufficient. The president would like to increase the Pentagon's budget by $38 billion more than what is currently allowed under U.S. law. He's even asked Congress to remove the spending caps imposed by sequestration to boost the military budget to a whopping $534 billion for the fiscal year. This monumental sum would not include an additional $51 billion to maintain military operations in Iraq and Syria and the continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Much of the money is going to fund proxy wars around the globe. The U.S. is training and arming Sunni tribal groups in Iraq to fight ISIS and considering supplying weapons to the Ukrainian military against Russia. Drone strikes continue to take their toll in Yemen after a Yemeni al-Qaeda affiliate took responsibility for orchestrating the attacks which killed 17 people at the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. Also at work are double standards, apparently to most of the rest of the world. Western hypocrisy denounced the French massacre as an affront to the rights of free speech while simultaneously surveilling and suppressing the speech of its own citizens in the name of fighting terror. U.S. interests in Saudi Arabia were evident when Secretary of State John Kerry praised deceased King Abdullah, whose human rights record rivals that of ISIS, And meanwhile, a jingoistic film called American Sniper, which glorifies killing and demonizes Muslims with virtually no historical context, has come close to breaking U.S. box office records. Joining me today to unravel U.S. policy is Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who's a regular columnist for Truthdig, also a senior fellow at the Nation Institute. He was a foreign correspondent with the New York Times for almost 2 decades. He's written a number of books, and his most recent is Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt with Joe Sacco. Welcome to Uprising, Chris.
Thank you, Sonali.
Now, so often for the American public, there is just no historical framework for understanding the role of U.S. imperialism in these various conflicts around the world. Do you think that this ignorance serves a very important purpose?
Yes, because if people understood the crimes of empire, how empire operates, they would be appalled. And I think for those of us, such as myself, who spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent on the outer reaches of empire, and had to report on and witness the inner workings of empire, the frustration that we run into when we come back to the United States is that the mythology of who we are and what we're doing and how we act overrides the reality. And that has been especially true in the wars in the Middle East, which have unleashed, horrific acts of industrial violence, been perpetrated through torture, assassinations, gross abuse of human rights, the displacement of millions, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocents. And yet it's almost impossible because the narrative about how empire works and what empire is about is taken over by popular culture. You mentioned American Sniper, that would be a good example. And so, penetrating that mythology is extremely difficult. So yes, they want people not only to be kept in ignorance, but to believe the myth rather than the reality.
So let's actually try to parse the reasons why we see some of these incidents taking place in the Middle East now that are stripped of their context. In a piece that you wrote last month for Truthdig called A Message from the Dispossessed, you made some very strong statements. You said the evil of predatory global capitalism and empire has spawned the evil of terrorism. And rather than understand the roots of that rage and attempt to ameliorate it, we have built sophisticated mechanisms of security and surveillance, passed laws that permit the targeted assassinations and torture of the weak, and amassed modern armies and the machines of industrial warfare to dominate the world by force. This is not about justice. It's not about the war on terror. It is not about liberty or democracy. It's not about the freedom of expression. It is about the mad scrambled by the privilege to survive at the expense of the poor, and the poor know it. So, Chris, are you saying in this quote that essentially this is about money, this is about wealth, this is about a wealth grab and capitalism?
Well, that's what empire exists for, to dominate natural resources and wealth. And that is the primary function of empire, and that is the primary function of empire's Praetorian Guard, which is the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence services. There's a reason that we've got our footprints all over the Middle East, and not in the Congo, where human rights abuses are far more egregious, of course, than anything committed by ISIS. That's number one. Number two is we conveniently forget, courtesy of corporate media that has no interest in perpetuating history or even fact-based reality. We conveniently forget the violence that we have delivered. The violence that we have carried out has spawned the rage and the violence that we are now witnessing, and that's what's always happens. That when you employ that kind of violence, it has a kind of centrifugal force, and it has blowback, and that's essentially. I mean, for instance, if you look at the burning of the Jordanian pilot in a cage, and it certainly was barbaric and awful. But what we're not cognizant of are all those families in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and anywhere else that from our militarized drones and our airstrikes were burned alive inside their houses. And if ISIS had an air force and militarized drones and heavy artillery and cruise missiles, they would obviously deliver that message from several thousand feet up to us and to our allies throughout the Middle East, but they don't. This is, of course, a crude version of what we do, but the difference is technological, not moral.
Let's talk about propaganda. An American Sniper in particular, there was news that the only theater in Baghdad has pulled screenings of American Sniper because Iraqis see the film as highly insulting, and yet here in the United States, of course, it's broken box office records. And do you see the videos by ISIS of their beheadings and this horrific burning of this pilot, etc., the awful photos pushing men perceived to be gay off of towers to their deaths as their form of propaganda akin to Hollywood producing American Sniper? I mean, essentially a war being fought on another level as well, a war of images?
Well, very much so. I mean, you know, we incinerate people from the sky. They incinerate a pilot in a cage. We train Shiite death squads to kill Sunnis. They train Sunni death squads to kill Shiites. You know, we produce this kind of propaganda. They produce their jihadist videos. We torture people in black sites and kill them by stuffing rags down their throats, and they behead them. You know, there is a kind of awful, horrific tit for tat or quid pro quo that our violence and our abuses have spawned reactionary violence. But that's not a narrative that is going to be peddled by a media that's dominated by corporations who have a vested interest in perpetuating these wars because they make a profit on it and they are able to dominate resources, in particular oil, as long as they stay in places like Iraq.
Now, Chris, I'm wondering what you make of the recent comments at the National Prayer Breakfast by President Obama, where he essentially compared, you know, what people are saying is a false moral equivalence, saying that lest we get on our high horse, think this is unique to some other place. Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. Setting aside for just a moment President Obama's role, of course, in pushing war and imperialism, do you think that his comments were relevant?
Of course. And I mean, let's just look at the whole reign of terror in the southern United States, you know, much of it perpetrated by white Christian churches, where black men, women, and even children were burned alive. If they weren't hung, they were often burned alive and hung in public squares where thousands of white Southerners watched, took pictures. They used to sell postcards of these, you know, lynchings and mutilations. They used to cut up the body afterwards and sell pieces for souvenirs. So it's a lot closer to home in terms of history than even the Crusades. But that's not something that, you know, we want to confront. To confront the crimes of empire, to confront, you know, what we are doing, is an existential crisis because it forces us to begin to ask who we are, to understand that evil is not something that is external, that's out there, but something that's internal. And that's, you know, a self-examination or a grappling with truth that much of the American public and certainly the systems of information, including the kind of entertainment systems, don't want disseminated. And that's how you get this horrific movie, American Sniper. And I wrote I don't usually go to those films. A friend of mine, Marty Brest, who's a great director, called me up and said I had to go see it. And I wrote this, you know, incendiary title because it's called Killing Ragheads for Jesus, but I did it on purpose because I found the movie to be, that was its core message, that you know, Muslims in that film, I don't know if you've seen it, are a subhuman. They are, you know, unfeeling towards their own family members, incapable of love, exist for vengeance, betrayal, and yeah, the fact that obviously, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not a few million Americans relate to it and find it an effective form of entertainment. Again, that's not new. Go back and look at Birth of a Nation, another racist propaganda film that swelled the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan, and that's essentially the role of American Sniper, to ignore what we've done, to demonize the enemy, and to celebrate violence. Boy, that is really a film that would have easily passed, Nazi censorship, and it is a terrifying, terrifying movie.
We actually did a debate between a critic of the film, Rania Khalek, and Jim DeFelice, a co-author with Chris Kyle of the book American Sniper that the film was based on. Our audience who missed that can catch it at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. And you can also catch Chris Hedges' writings at truthdig.com, including his piece about American Sniper. So, Chris, let's talk about President Obama. In addition to, on the one hand, you have him making statements that we progressives can nod our head and say, yes, exactly. And on the other hand, he is very much the biggest champion of pushing forward this war, feeding into it, asking Congress for more money than the military has even asked for, and that even, outdoing the Republicans, if you will. How do we reconcile that in this president? In other ways, he has pushed some more progressive issues in his last 2 years of Congress after the last elections, but on this issue of the war with ISIS, he's going full speed ahead.
Well, because he works for them, they don't work for him. And that's true in terms of his inability to regulate or control Wall Street, to stem the gross and evisceration of our most basic constitutional rights, including the right to privacy, and in terms of the war machine. You go back a few decades and you had at least a wing of the Democratic Party, Proxmire, McGovern, others, who would challenge, these monstrous procurement programs and spending programs within the military. That doesn't exist anymore. The military gets whatever it wants, and that's because the corporate state and its armed wing, the U.S. military, which in essence does its bidding, is beyond control, and that's very frightening. So Obama can say whatever he wants, and I certainly applaud him for saying it and not buying into this kind of rabid Christian right war against Islam. But at the same time, he's unable in any way to, effectively curtail, stem, regulate, or control the major institutions that have power, including the war industry.
Chris, do you see a connection between our foreign policy that targets brown, poor people in countries like Iraq and our domestic policy here in the United States that sees African Americans and people of color as the biggest targets of state police violence?
Yes. What happens when empires decline, this is true for all empires, is that the harsher forms of control on the outer reaches of empire migrate back to the center of empire because empires hollow themselves out from the inside. You can see it through crumbling infrastructure, the increasing impoverishment, now half the country living in either poverty or near poverty, the assault on public education, on public services, and so as the empire essentially disintegrates from within, the forms of control, the violent forms of control that are used to maintain empire's borders, become the tools that are used to maintain internal control. So that's why you see drones, police and law enforcement officials now using drones. It's why you see wholesale surveillance. It's why you see militarized police forces. It's why you see a range of laws that have taken away our most cherished civil liberties. And, as you know, I sued Obama over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act.
Yes.
Won in the Southern Court, then they appealed it, and the decision was overturned. But that is a law that allows the U.S. military to seize American citizens who are deemed to be terrorists in the eyes of the state, strip them of due process, and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. Absolutely terrifying. So yes, there is a complete correlation. And what's happened with the so-called war on drugs is that, and this is what, it's the marginal communities who always suffer first. They went into these marginal communities and created police states where law enforcement officials are, beyond control. They can kick down your door, they can stop you at random, and then they stack you with all sorts of charges. 94% of those who are charged with crimes in this country never even get inside a courtroom. They have to plea out. They'll stack you with 18, 19 charges, very few of which you committed, and they use that as a kind of bargaining chip. And then, on top of it, we are seeing increasing examples of a kind of extortion where, as part of that plea deal, they have to sign agreements that they won't appeal. So this is what Hannah Arendt writes about when she talks about the creation within totalitarian states of omnipotent police forces who go after a particular segment of a society, in her case, stateless Jews, who are stripped of their rights. But then as soon as a society or a despotic government needs that mechanism for control against the wider population, they not only have the legal basis for it, but they have the physical infrastructure with which to carry it out. So yeah, there's a kind of horrible convergence between the crimes that are committed abroad and the crimes that are committed at home. And we haven't even spoken about the effects of climate change, the fact that the speculation on Wall Street is ultimately not sustainable. That they all know what's coming and they're preparing. And with a flick of a switch, it's the iron fist.
Following up on what you were mentioning regarding how people are impoverished here through the legal system, civil rights attorneys in Ferguson, Missouri, have launched a lawsuit over the traffic court. They're calling it a modern debtor's prison. Chris, you also wrote about Malcolm X recently on the 50th anniversary of his assassination, saying that it was he rather than King who got it right on the issue of the inner workings of empire. How so? I mean, King did talk about economic justice.
Yes, but King believed that, in essence, America had a conscience, or at least that was his public, that was part of his public campaign. I think you could argue that at the end of King's life, he essentially understood, like Malcolm, that empire has no conscience. But I think Malcolm, because he came out of a very different milieu, he grew up on the streets, he was in foster homes, he dropped out of school when he was 15, he was in prison. He understood in a way that King, who grew up, in essence, in the upper middle class, didn't. The heartlessness of empire, that empire exists to exploit and repress what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, at home and abroad. And that we were never going to appeal to the better angels of those who orchestrated that empire, that it was only with the dismantling or destruction of empire that we could begin to talk about not only racial justice, but any kind of real liberty or justice at home and overseas. And Malcolm got it. And Malcolm was right about America. And I think certainly by the last year of King's life, if not earlier, King got it as well. The crimes of empire, which go all the way back to when we began empire. Essentially, we colonized our own in terms of indigenous communities, then went on the Spanish-American War, etc. The crimes of empire finally come back to haunt those who maintain empire, and that's precisely what we're seeing. If we don't wake up to what empire is, the nature of empire itself, which is about the commodification of human beings, turning human beings into objects, the constant exploitation. And this is why Sacco and I, Joe Sacco, did our book Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, where we went into the sacrifice zones, the poorest pockets of the United States, and said, look, here's what unfettered, unregulated capitalism does when it has no checks, because we're all about to become one huge sacrifice zone. So yeah, I think Malcolm was far more prescient on that issue throughout his life than King was.
And the title of that piece, Malcolm X was right about America. Chris's latest article, The Terror We Give is the Terror We Get. All of his articles can be found at christic.com. Chris Hedges, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, as usual.
Thank you, Sonali.
Chris Hedges has been my guest. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who is a regular columnist for Truthstick. He's also a senior fellow at the Nation Institute. He was a foreign correspondent with the New York Times for 2 decades. He's written a number of books, and his most recent was a collaboration with the political cartoonist Joe Sacco called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. He has a forthcoming book out later this year. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. By the year 2050, the elderly population in the United States will close to double in number, with those aged 65 and older consisting of nearly 84 million people. Along with the aging baby boomer generation will be an increasing need for more home health care workers. Despite this growing demand, many home care workers struggle to secure even a living wage, being exempt from minimum wage laws in the U.S. Worker advocates had been hopeful that the U.S. Labor Department would pave the way for better wages and worker protections, but last month all hopes were dashed. To the dismay of close to 2 million home health care workers in this country, Federal District Court Judge Richard Leon struck down a regulation that would have extended U.S. minimum wage and overtime pay laws to these workers. One of the greatest advocates for caregivers is Ai-Jen Poo. She received national recognition in 2014 when she was named a Macarthur Genius. In 2012, she was included in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World. She's the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and has championed for domestic workers' rights for many years. Her new book, The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom in a Changing America, articulates the growing importance of at-home caregivers and how we can meet coming demand. She now joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising, Ai-Jen Poo.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, whenever people think about the specter of having to institutionalize their own parents or grandparents, or even if they have the foresight to think about how they themselves, in several decades might end up, it's frightening. It's frightening to think about sending your parents or grandparents off to a nursing home. But most of us can't afford home healthcare workers either, and those that are available are very poorly paid. And so all around, it's just a terrible setup and situation.
It is. It's a situation that has come into being because we've never actually accounted for the work that goes into supporting families and caring for families across generations. The U.S. is one of the few countries that doesn't have any social programs in place for long-term care comprehensively.
I mean, we have Social Security and we have Medicare for the elderly to have them some level of income and health care, but you're saying that there's no actual system in place for home health care.
Or really any form of long-term care. So if you're very wealthy, you might be able to afford long-term care insurance. And even that doesn't necessarily cover what you need when you need it. And if you're very poor, you might be eligible for Medicaid, but that is a very institution-based model, nursing home-based model, and it also doesn't meet the full range of needs that people with disabilities and our elders have. And then there are millions of people in between for whom neither of those options actually work. And so we just don't have a solution for the long-term care needs for the future. We don't have a plan. And what that means is because by 2050, 27 million Americans will need some form of long-term care assistance. Not having a plan is actually one of the biggest challenges of our time. We think that that's actually a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity to put into place the systems and supports we need and frankly have needed for a very long time. But now we have no choice but to actually figure it out. And the way we need to do it is with bringing workers and seniors and consumers and families together so that we can make sure that no one gets left behind and no one's dignity is compromised in the process.
Why have home health care workers been exempt from minimum wage laws? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, we know that people in the service industry, those who wait tables, we are told shouldn't get minimum wage because they get tips. Whether one agrees with that or not, one can sort of see the justification. But why home health care workers?
It's a story that goes back about 75 years. When the New Deal was being negotiated in Congress in the 1930s, the core labor law kind of pillars of the New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, were very controversial. And the Southern members of Congress essentially refused to sign on to those pieces of legislation if they included farm workers and domestic workers who were African American at the time. And so in a concession to those Southern Congress people, essentially those laws were put into place, they were enacted with those exclusions, and they remain to this day. Now, over the years, domestic workers have organized and successfully won inclusion in pieces of those bills. But something was put into place in the 70s called the companionship exemption, which basically said that home health care work, home care work, and caregiving work was not actually real work. It was simply companionship and therefore should be exempted from labor protections. And so here we are in 2015 with a direct care workforce of almost more than 3 million workers who are, many of whom are stuck in the shadows working and still actually denied real recognition as real workers and therefore not protected by minimum wage and overtime laws. And it's difficult to imagine in 2015 that that's actually the reality at the moment when we should be strengthening this workforce and ensuring that these jobs, which will be the jobs of the future, right? Let's be clear about that these jobs are actually good jobs that you can take pride in and support your family on.
So how has the demographic of the workers changed, if at all? You mentioned that the African Americans were many of these workers at the time when this exemption was carved out. Today, is that still largely true? Are we also seeing immigrant women in particular?
It's a very diverse workforce and very varied in terms of where you are in the country. Here in Los Angeles, it's incredibly diverse. There are many African American and immigrant women doing this work. Nationally, we estimate about a third of all home care workers and caregivers are immigrant, many of whom are undocumented, and also a tremendous number of African American women who've really done a lot to both establish labor standards through unionization and organizing in the sector and really raise wages from poverty wages to and really raise wages for this workforce over time.
Now, the situation in that we're talking about when we have these two populations, our elders in our community and workers who are just not paid very well, that it seems as though that is essentially a recipe for disaster, a recipe that ensures misery on all sides. We know that when people are well paid and they take pride in their work because they're well paid, they do their jobs better. I mean, any of us in this situation would act similarly. Those people who are well paid tend to have lower turnover in their jobs. They tend to be happier. They tend to take pride in their work. And if they're underpaid, you have situations arise where there can be abuse, there can be neglect, people are just overworked and frazzled and anxious.
That's right. I mean, when you have a situation where the people that you count on to take care of your families can't take care of their own on their wages because they're earning poverty wages, there's something fundamentally wrong with that system. And that is what we have to change, and that is the opportunity at hand. The fact that tens of millions of Americans will be counting on this workforce. And it's not just seniors, and it's not just people with disabilities. When we think about the millions of sandwich generation working parents who are struggling to juggle going to work, taking care of their children, and the needs of their aging loved ones. I mean, this really is something that affects all of us. This is why we always talk about, we always quote Rosalind Carter when she said that there are only 4 kinds of people in the world: people who are caregivers or will be caregivers, people who need care or will need care. And it's a universal experience. We should not relegate this to something that will be faced by either home care workers or seniors. This issue touches all of us, and we all have a stake in changing it.
And so we have a major shortage, and we'll have a great shortage of home health care workers as the aging population booms. And of course, and one of the things you point out in your book is we should be celebrating the fact that there are so many elderly folks, because it means that Americans are living longer, and living longer is something that we shouldn't decry or fret about. I mean, individually, we all
Exactly.
want to live longer.
We do, and it's just really a question of how we will live
Yeah.
and the support we put into place. And there are so many opportunities in doing so. I mean, just even thinking about the relationship between millennials and their grandparents right now, millennials are more connected to their grandparents than any other generation in the history of this country. We have the opportunity to live multi-generationally in new and unprecedented ways, which adds so much richness to our culture. In every direction. And so it's the opportunity to live longer, to learn longer, to teach longer, to connect longer. And we just think that we need it, the opportunity can only be realized if we put into place the kinds of support we need, supporting our nation's caregivers, home care workers, and the loved ones that they take care of together. It's a win-win.
Let's talk about the solutions that can be put into place, in addition to, of course, ending this exemption for domestic workers, for home health care workers, which essentially the Supreme Court said that it's up to Congress to enact laws that protect these workers. What about folding rights into a comprehensive immigration reform bill? Or is that, as CIR has essentially turned into this bizarre a phantom bill, not something to be relied on?
You know, we actually think that the home care rule change that we were working with the Department of Labor to move forward is going to happen. That 2 million home care workers who are currently excluded will have these rights and protections. We're still fighting it out in court. There's an appeal happening right now. And so we think that it is actually inevitable.
And we're talking about them being eligible for minimum wage. Minimum wage itself is not high enough right now.
No.
What are folks getting paid?
Absolutely. The average wages are around $9 an hour, and it's just simply not enough to live off of. You cannot make ends meet. I was just talking to a caregiver in Chicago who said that on her wages, after she sends money home to her family, that oftentimes she doesn't have enough for food and has to survive off of hard-boiled eggs and bananas. I mean, there's a food security issue in the fastest growing occupation in this country. It's just to kind of be real about what the situation is here. But I do think that there are many opportunities for solutions, and that solutions are actually being developed everywhere we turn. And it's everything from raising wages to establishing training programs. There's a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art home care training program in the state of Washington that should serve as a model for states around the country. 40,000 home care workers getting trained every year in 12 different languages, elevating the quality of care and ultimately allowing for a level of professionalization and career development that actually helps to recognize the true skills and capacity of this amazing workforce that we've so undervalued. In the state of Maine, which is the oldest state in the country, they've introduced a comprehensive state package called the Keep Me Home Initiative, and it supports our elders to be able to have better access to transportation. And it also supports better wages and supports for family caregivers and paid caregivers. So there are states that are starting to see how these interests are interconnected and building solutions from the bottom up, from localities to states. And I think ultimately we will turn the tide in this country to really embrace the opportunity here.
Now, in your book, The Age of Dignity, you open with a heartbreaking story of your own grandfather and watching him essentially, his health deteriorate to the point that your father couldn't take care of him and he had to be put into a nursing home, and he just died within months, and that it was just a very depressing scenario. What is the ideal scenario that you as an organizer would like to see elders look forward to in their, the golden years of their life?
I believe in an interconnected, interdependent culture, and I believe that our elders who've taken care of us should have many options for how they want to live as they age and grow older. For some, it will be staying at home Like my grandmother, she stays at home in her apartment that she shared with my grandfather. She's supported by a home care worker named Mrs. Sun, and she's very active. For others, that won't be an option, and they will look for assisted living facilities or nursing homes. But I believe that every single one of those options should be an option to live with dignity, that our elders should never feel alone, and they should have the supports that they need that really enhance their dignity as they grow older, as opposed to unravel it.
And what about envisioning a government-run system like Medicare or Social Security that really focuses on health and caregiving of elders, not just sending them a check or giving them health insurance, but actual care?
Yeah, I think that the investment on the part of government, right, it's a down payment on our future, has to be to make these jobs better jobs and to make quality care more affordable for every family and every senior who needs it. So we actually talk about a triptych, 3 goals. One is better quality jobs in caregiving. The other is more affordable, accessible, quality care. And the third is really thinking about choices, making lots of choices available for families and seniors because the conditions and the needs are so varied across all of our families.
How does the conversation around elder care, how is that tackled, if at all, in our mainstream media today? Before you wrote your book, because it has been making the rounds of media, which is great, of course, to bring this conversation up. But how does the neoliberal vision, or what does the neoliberal vision of elder care look like? Do they even acknowledge that this is an issue worth considering, or is the standard approach, individuals are responsible for their own health and well-being and care, is that essentially the one that's taken?
There's a major challenge that we're up against that is also an opportunity here. The challenge is that every time you talk about putting the right programs in place, the response is always about cost. It's going to be too costly. And
because too many people are living too long, right? We keep hearing that.
Except that the reality is that we are already paying a tremendous cost through not being proactive by this. There's a cost being borne by families that they absolutely cannot bear. There's a cost being borne by people like my grandfather who deserved to die with dignity and to live his last days at home, if that was what he chose. There is a cost being borne by our healthcare system because it is incredibly inefficient in how it handles our aging loved ones. Chronic illnesses, hospital stays, readmissions, all of these things could be so much better managed if we integrated the home care worker and the kind of home care, the caregiving that happens at the family and community level into the healthcare delivery system better. So there are so many ways in which, by making a proactive investment in home care and in real choices for caregiving, that we can not only save our system money, but actually relieve the unbelievable emotional and spiritual burden that we're all facing already.
You worked to conceive and pass the New York Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, which champions domestic worker rights and campaigns for visibility of these workers. What is included in this Bill of Rights, and is this something that, are there state-level efforts in other states around the country?
Well, to be clear, the domestic workers bill in New York was won by domestic workers themselves, going to Albany, taking days off from work, sacrificing their pay to tell their stories and to shine a light on their experiences. And really, New York State would not function without the work that makes all of the work possible, without domestic work. And I think it took us a 7-year campaign, but that actually was what the state of New York recognized when the bill was passed. Since then, 4 additional states have passed legislation, actually 3 additional states. Connecticut is on the slate for this year, as is Illinois. Those are the 2 next states that we're hoping will enact domestic worker rights. But we already have victories in Hawaii, in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was 2014, and we were really proud to win maternity leave for caregivers for the first time in the country. So there's momentum, and the states are really taking this on. Many of them are really stepping out, and we think that the same will happen when it comes to elder care, that many localities and states who will be more in tune with what's happening to seniors and caregivers in their local communities will actually take the courageous steps that are needed to make this a reality for the future.
It seems as though we need a cultural shift as well on both the populations that we're talking about here, which is the home healthcare workers themselves, who are clearly doing a job well beyond simply companionship, and how we view the elders of our community, of our society. Let's talk about home healthcare workers. You mentioned Mrs. Sun, the woman who has become like a member of your family, who takes care of your grandmother. What is the typical day, if you will, in the work day of a home healthcare worker?
Home healthcare workers are experts in so many things, everything from nutrition to administering medication. The academics call it activities of daily living, but they essentially support our aging loved ones and people with disabilities to manage very basic activities such that they can live independently. And cooking, cleaning, helping move people from place to place, sometimes physical therapy, and all kinds of tasks related to managing chronic illnesses.
Personal hygiene.
All kinds of things. And
it's a physically demanding job as well.
It is a physically demanding job. And one of the things that we're seeing is that more and more storytellers, you talked about culture, more and more storytellers are starting to tell the stories of both people who are aging and grappling with chronic illnesses and their caregivers. And so this year we saw Still Alice, this film with Julianne Moore about her struggle with Alzheimer's and really about her family coming together as a care circle to support her through that. We saw The Theory of Everything about Stephen Hawking with ALS, and there's going to be a number of documentaries coming out in 2015 that really shine a light on the experience of caregivers in particular. And one that we're especially excited about is called Care, and it follows 3 home care workers through their day-to-day lives. And we hope your listeners will really look out for that, because it's going to be an unprecedented view into the life of caregivers, which we think is going to be a huge part of raising awareness about just the incredible work that this is and the contribution, really, that
and
it is.
Then our culture and the cultural shift that needs to happen with how we view the nation's elderly. I mean, in other countries, this might be romanticizing it too much, but it appears as though you see the elders of a society revered as the wise ones, those who are much, much more highly regarded. Here in the United States, I think we tend to see older folks as invisible, as an inconvenience. I was on a plane this weekend, and there were a couple of folks who were trying to get their bags, and they were holding up the line. But it was just a couple of minutes, and the complaints that I heard from people who might have just been a decade younger, literally just someone in their 50s complaining about folks who are in their 60s or 70s taking a few extra minutes to get out of their seat and roll their bags. And it just shocked me the level of vitriol that we see our elderly receiving. And people have this blind spot about the fact that one day that will be them.
Right. We have this attitude towards aging that really is fear-based, which is where denial and kind of pushing it away really manifests itself. And that's why a lot of our work is about really embracing both the joys and the complexities of aging together. And one of the things I'm doing with my book tour is asking people that I meet to actually go back home to their families and have a conversation over dinner about aging and caregiving with 2 simple guiding questions. The first being, how can we as a family prepare for our future caregiving needs? And the second being, what do we imagine will be the joys of aging and caring for one another? so that we can actually start from a place of planning and preparation and connectedness, and thinking about what might be the opportunity for us to be able to grow as a family and as communities through embracing aging.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us in studio today. Ai-Jen Poo, best of luck with your book tour. Is there a website you'd like to give out?
Yes, absolutely. You can follow us on www.caringacrossamerica.com, and we hope you'll check it out and also have that dinner table conversation with your family.
There we go, and we'll post that to our website later today. Thank you so much, and best of luck.
Thank you for having me.
My guest is Ai-Jen Poo. She is the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and co-director of the Caring Across Generations campaign, a 2014 Macarthur Foundation Fellow. Her book is called The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom in a Changing America. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.